In the summer of 1944, a British tank crew stationed in Normandy made a discovery that would fundamentally alter the course of armoured warfare. They fired a shell that, by all conventional understanding of ballistics and metallurgy, should not have worked. The German Tiger tank in their sights had armour so thick that standard British anti-tank rounds simply bounced off like pebbles against a castle wall. Yet when this particular shell struck, something extraordinary happened. The Tiger didn't just stop. It erupted into flames from the inside out, its crew killed instantly not by the penetration of armour, but by something far more devastating. What that British crew had fired was the product of one of the most closely guarded secrets of World War II, a weapon so revolutionary that even today, 80 years after its deployment, the exact production figures remain classified by the British government. This is the story of the Armor Piercing Discarding Sabot round, the APDS, and the physics breakthrough that made the thickness of armour almost irrelevant. To understand why this weapon was so revolutionary, we need to go back to 1940, to a Britain that stood alone against Nazi Germany. The evacuation at Dunkirk had been completed, but Britain had left behind virtually all of its heavy equipment in France. Hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles, and most critically, the psychological advantage in armoured warfare now belonged entirely to Germany. The panzer divisions had demonstrated a new kind of warfare, blitzkrieg, where speed and armoured might crush opposition before it could organise. British tank designers found themselves in a desperate race, not just to match German tanks, but to overcome them. The problem was fundamental and seemingly insurmountable. To penetrate armour, you need a projectile that is both extremely hard and extremely fast. The kinetic energy of a projectile is determined by a simple formula: half the mass multiplied by the velocity squared. This means that if you want to double the penetrating power, you can either quadruple the mass or double the velocity. For tank designers in the early war years, the natural instinct was to go bigger. Bigger shells, bigger guns, bigger tanks to carry those guns. The Germans understood this perfectly. Their response to encountering the heavily armoured Soviet KV-1 and T-34 tanks on the Eastern Front was to develop even bigger tanks with even bigger guns. The Tiger I, introduced in 1942, mounted an 88mm gun and had frontal armour up to 100mm thick. Its successor, the Tiger II or King Tiger, pushed this even further with armour up to 180mm thick. But Britain had a problem that Germany didn't face quite as acutely. British tanks had to be shipped across oceans. They had to fit within the loading gauges of British railways. They had to cross bridges designed for civilian traffic. There were practical limits to how big British tanks could be. The Churchill infantry tank, one of Britain's main battle tanks, mounted only a 57mm gun initially. Against a Tiger or Panther, it was hopelessly outmatched. British tank crews in North Africa and later in Italy reported engagement after engagement, where their shells simply bounced off German armour, while a single return shot from a German tank could penetrate their armour with ease. Something had to change, and it couldn't just be making everything bigger. The British needed to think differently about the entire problem. This is where our story takes a turn into the realm of cutting-edge physics, and into the laboratories where a handful of British scientists were working on a concept that would revolutionise anti-armour warfare. The key insight came from looking at that kinetic energy formula again. Velocity is squared in the equation, which means it has an exponentially greater effect than mass. If you could double the velocity of a projectile, you could achieve the same penetrative effect with only a quarter of the mass. But there was a catch. The velocity of a projectile fired from a gun is limited by the pressure the gun barrel can withstand and the weight of the projectile itself. Fire a heavier shell and it moves slower. The propellant charge can only do so much work, and that work gets divided between accelerating the projectile and reinforcing the barrel against the explosive forces. Here's where British ingenuity entered the picture. What if you could trick the gun into thinking it was firing a heavy shell, giving you all that barrel pressure and propellant energy, but then actually accelerate only a much lighter projectile? The answer was a principle called the sabot, a French word meaning shoe. The concept was surprisingly simple in theory, but extraordinarily difficult in practice. You take a small, dense penetrator core made of the hardest material you can find. Then you surround this core with a lightweight carrier, the sabot, that fits the full bore of the gun. When fired, the entire assembly travels down the barrel, with the Sabot providing the surface area to catch all the propellant gases and pressure. But once the assembly leaves the barrel and hits the air, the Sabot petals away and falls off, leaving only the small, dense penetrator to fly toward the target at an unprecedented velocity. The physics was beautiful. By using a sub-caliber penetrator, you dramatically reduced the mass being accelerated, which meant the same propellant charge could push it much faster. Early calculations suggested velocities nearly twice what conventional ammunition could achieve. But turning this theory into a practical weapon proved to be one of the most challenging engineering projects of the war. The first challenge was materials. The penetrator core needed to be made of something incredibly dense and hard. The British settled on tungsten carbide, one of the hardest materials known to science at the time. Tungsten carbide could maintain its structure even under the enormous stresses of high-velocity impact. It wouldn't shatter or deform the way softer materials would. But tungsten was a strategic material, needed for machine tools and other critical applications. Using it for ammunition meant diverting it from other essential war production. The decision to proceed was a gamble, a bet that the tactical advantage would be worth the strategic cost. The second challenge was the Sabot itself. It needed to grip the penetrator firmly during firing, withstand the enormous acceleration forces as the shell travelled down the barrel, then reliably separate and fall away once it left the muzzle. If the Sabot separated too early, the gases would blow past it and velocity would be lost. If it separated too late or not at all, the aerodynamics would be catastrophic and accuracy would be impossible. The British engineers tested dozens of designs: 2-piece sabots, 3-piece sabots, sabots made of aluminum, steel, even plastics. Each design was tested and refined through countless firing trials. The third challenge was the gun itself. Achieving the velocities needed meant pushing existing gun designs to their absolute limits. The barrels had to withstand pressures they were never designed for. The British decided to adapt their successful 17-pounder anti-tank gun, a weapon that was already being mounted on Sherman Firefly tanks and towed as a field gun. But even the 17-pounder needed modifications to handle the new ammunition. Barrel wear became a serious concern. The high velocities meant the rifling was being eroded at an accelerated rate, reducing the lifespan of each barrel. By late 1943, after 3 years of intensive development, the first APDS rounds were ready for field testing. The results were extraordinary. A standard 17-pounder firing conventional armor-piercing ammunition could penetrate about 130 millimeters of armor at 500 meters. The same gun firing APDS could penetrate over 200 millimeters at the same range. Suddenly no German tank was safe. Even the mighty King Tiger, with its massively thick frontal armor, could be defeated by a relatively small British gun. But there was another effect, one that the designers hadn't fully anticipated, but that would prove devastatingly effective in combat. When a conventional armor-piercing shell penetrates armor, it typically makes a relatively clean hole. The shell passes through, and while this is certainly destructive, much of the shell's energy is wasted in deforming the armor around the penetration point. The APDS round behaved differently. Because of its enormous velocity and the properties of tungsten carbide, when it struck armor, it created what's known as an adiabatic shear. The impact was so violent and so concentrated that the armor didn't just crack or deform, it liquefied at the point of impact. The penetrator punched through, but as it did, it created a devastating spray of molten armor fragments that travelled into the crew compartment at supersonic speeds. This shower of molten metal and tungsten particles would instantly ignite ammunition, fuel, anything flammable. German tank crews reported, in the few cases where they survived being hit by APDS, that it was as if a blast furnace had suddenly erupted inside their tank. The first combat use of APDS came during the Normandy campaign in the summer of 1944. British tank crews who had spent years feeling outgunned by German armour suddenly found themselves with a weapon that could engage and destroy any German tank they encountered. The psychological impact on German tank crews was profound. The Tiger and Panther tanks had given German crews a sense of near invulnerability. They had grown accustomed to being able to engage Allied tanks at ranges where return fire was ineffective. A PDS changed that calculus completely. A British Sherman Firefly, a tank that the Germans had learned to recognise and prioritise as a target, but still considered manageable, could now destroy a Tiger at ranges that had previously been safe. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn into the realm of wartime secrecy and deception. The British were acutely aware that they had developed something extraordinary, and they were equally aware that if the Germans fully understood what they were facing, countermeasures might be developed. So a deliberate policy of secrecy was implemented. Tank crews were instructed to police their firing positions and recover spent sabot petals whenever possible. The distinctive appearance of these petals would immediately tell a German analyst that something new was being used. After-action reports were censored to remove references to the ammunition type. Even the designation was kept vague. APDS rounds were referred to in documents simply as special ammunition, or by code names that revealed nothing about their nature. The secrecy extended to production figures, and this is where we encounter one of the enduring mysteries of World War II munitions production. We know how many conventional shells of every type were produced by Britain during the war. The records are detailed and publicly available, but for APDS, the records remain classified even today. Historians have made educated guesses based on fragmentary evidence, references in war diaries, mentions in unit records, occasional photographs showing stockpiles. The estimates range from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of rounds, but nobody outside the British government knows for certain. Why the continued secrecy? The most likely explanation is that the fundamental principles behind APDS were so valuable and remained relevant for so long after the war that revealing production details might reveal technical information that could aid adversaries even decades later. There's also the matter of tungsten sourcing. Britain didn't have significant domestic tungsten deposits. The tungsten for APDS had to be imported, much of it from neutral Portugal, which also sold tungsten to Germany. The exact arrangements, the prices paid, the quantities involved, all of this was politically sensitive both during and after the war. Revealing APDS production figures would indirectly reveal how much tungsten Britain was securing, which could expose intelligence sources and methods that might have remained useful in the Cold War era. As the war progressed into 1945, APDS became more widely distributed among British armoured units. The ammunition was no longer restricted to special circumstances. Tank crews could expect to have at least a few rounds available for each engagement. The effect on German armour tactics was noticeable. German tank commanders became more cautious, more willing to break off engagements, more aware that their armour advantage had been negated. In the final months of the war in Europe, as German forces were pushed back toward the Rhine and then into Germany itself, British tank units equipped with APDS firing guns consistently achieved kill ratios that would have been unthinkable just a year earlier. But the story of APDS doesn't end with World War II. In fact, the war's end was just the beginning of this technology's impact on armoured warfare. The Cold War brought a new confrontation, this time between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and once again, Britain found itself facing the prospect of Soviet tanks that were larger, more heavily armoured, and more numerous than anything the West could field. The principles pioneered with APDS became the foundation for all subsequent kinetic energy anti-armour weapons. The next evolution was the Armor Piercing Stabilized Discarding Sabot round, or APFSDS, which took the concept even further. Instead of relying on the spin imparted by a rifled barrel, APFSDS rounds use fins for stabilization, allowing them to be even smaller in diameter and achieve even higher velocities. Modern tank guns firing a PFSDS can achieve muzzle velocities exceeding a mile per second, and penetrators made of depleted uranium can defeat armour over a metre thick. Every modern main battle tank in the world uses some form of discarding sabot technology. The American M1 Abrams, the German Leopard 2, the British Challenger 2, the Russian T-90, the Chinese Type 99. All of them rely on the fundamental principles that British scientists and engineers worked out in the desperate years of World War II. The projectiles have become more sophisticated. Some use depleted uranium for even greater density than tungsten. Some have complex multi-stage penetrators designed to defeat reactive armour. Some are even designed to self-sharpen on impact, maintaining their penetrating ability even as they bore through multiple layers of protection. But at their core, they all work the same way. A lightweight sabot accelerates a dense, hard penetrator to extreme velocities, then falls away, allowing the penetrator to strike armour with devastating kinetic energy. There's a fascinating epilogue to this story that brings us back to that original question about secrecy. In the 1970s, as Cold War tensions were high, NATO was conducting exercises to test its ability to defend Western Europe against a potential Soviet armoured thrust. British Chieftain tanks, equipped with the latest APDS ammunition, were able to achieve kills against simulated Soviet tanks at ranges exceeding 2 miles. The Soviets, who had extensive intelligence networks in Western Europe, were desperate to understand how this was possible. They knew about discarding sabot technology in general. After all, they had developed their own versions. But the specific performance characteristics of British ammunition, the exact composition of the penetrators, the metallurgy of the sabots, these were closely guarded secrets. In 1982, during the Falklands War, British forces had the opportunity to test their weapons in actual combat conditions again, this time against Argentine forces equipped with a mix of older British and American tanks. While the Falklands was primarily an infantry and naval conflict, there were several engagements involving Argentine armoured vehicles. British forces, equipped with modern APDS rounds, achieved kills at ranges and under conditions that would have been impossible with World War II-era technology. After the war, British defence analysts conducted detailed studies of ammunition performance. These studies remain classified. The question of why such old information remains secret has multiple answers. Part of it is simply bureaucratic inertia. Information that was classified decades ago often remains classified simply because nobody has bothered to declassify it, and there's no compelling reason to do so. But there's also a more substantive reason. The exact metallurgical composition of tungsten carbide penetrators, the specific alloys used in sabots, the precise geometries that allow reliable separation at high velocities, all of this information is still relevant. Companies that manufacture modern ammunition still use refinements of these same techniques. Revealing details about World War II-era production might reveal information about manufacturing processes that are still proprietary or strategically sensitive. There's also the matter of tungsten supply chains. Today, just as in World War II, tungsten is a strategic material. China controls the majority of the world's tungsten production. Any information about historical tungsten usage, sourcing, and supply chain management could potentially provide insights into current strategic material dependencies. In an era where economic warfare and supply chain security are recognized as critical national security issues, even 80-year-old data about tungsten consumption could be considered sensitive. Let's return to the human element of this story, because behind all the physics and metallurgy and strategic considerations were individual people making life and death decisions. British tank crews in 1944 and 1945 knew they had a special weapon, but they often didn't fully understand how it worked or why it was so effective. They just knew that when they loaded one of the rounds marked with special identification, their chances of survival went up dramatically. German tank crews, for their part, struggled to understand why tanks that should have been impervious were suddenly vulnerable. Some German after-action reports from late in the war describe British shells that seemed to burn through armour, a description that's remarkably accurate given the adiabatic shear effect. One particularly telling incident occurred in March 1945 during the crossing of the Rhine. A single British Comet tank armed with a 77mm gun firing APDS engaged a platoon of German Panther tanks. The Comet was a relatively new design, lighter and faster than the Churchill or Cromwell tanks it was meant to supplement. On paper, it should have been outmatched by the Panthers with their more powerful guns and heavier armour. But the Comet crew, well trained and equipped with APDS, destroyed 3 Panthers in rapid succession before the remaining German tanks withdrew. The engagement lasted less than 5 minutes. When analysts examined the destroyed Panthers later, they found that each had been killed with a single shot. The penetrators had passed completely through the frontal armour, travelled through the crew compartment, and in 2 cases, exited through the rear armour. The crews died instantly. This kind of catastrophic kill, where a single shot destroys the target completely, was exactly what the APDS designers had hoped for but hadn't quite dared to expect. The development of APDS also had unexpected effects on tank design philosophy. Once it became clear that kinetic energy rounds could defeat practically any thickness of armour, designers began to question whether heavy armour was worth the weight penalty. This led to the development of tanks like the British FV-4201 Chieftain, which relied more on slope and spacing of armour rather than pure thickness, and eventually to modern tank designs that use composite armour, reactive armour, and active protection systems rather than simply making the armour thicker. The entire trajectory of tank development after World War II was shaped by the realization that armour alone couldn't provide protection, against kinetic energy penetrators. There's a certain irony in the fact that the British, who developed APDS out of necessity because they couldn't build tanks as large as the Germans, ended up creating a technology that made large, heavily armoured tanks obsolete. The German supertanks, the Tigers and King Tigers and Jag Tigers, all that massive armour that required enormous engines and complex transmissions and reinforced suspensions, all of it became largely irrelevant in the face of a small tungsten penetrator travelling at 3,000 feet per second. The Germans, in their pursuit of ever heavier armour, had trapped themselves in an arms race they couldn't win. Each increase in armour thickness required a bigger tank, which required a bigger engine, which required more fuel, which Germany didn't have. Meanwhile, the British had found a way to bypass the entire problem by making the armour thickness irrelevant. As we look back from the perspective of 80 years, we can see APDS as a perfect example of how asymmetric thinking can overcome material disadvantages. Britain couldn't outproduce Germany in terms of heavy tanks. They couldn't build tanks with thicker armour or bigger guns, not within the constraints they faced. But they could innovate. They could apply scientific principles in new ways. They could take risks on unproven technologies. The decision to invest in APDS was a gamble. It diverted critical materials, tungsten, from other uses. It required thousands of hours of research and development at a time when those resources were desperately needed elsewhere. It meant trusting in physics and mathematics over the tried and tested approach of simply building bigger guns. That gamble paid off, not just in terms of tactical advantage during the war, but in establishing Britain as a leader in armoured warfare technology for decades afterward. British-designed tank guns and ammunition remained among the world's best throughout the Cold War. The L7 105mm gun, a British design that fired APFSD ammunition, became the standard armament for Western tanks and was manufactured under license by dozens of countries. Even today, British defence contractors are at the forefront of kinetic energy penetrator development. The story of APDs also serves as a reminder of how much of military history remains hidden. We know the dates of battles, the names of generals, the movements of armies, but the technical details, the scientific breakthroughs, the engineering innovations that actually determine the outcomes of those battles often remain obscure. The tank crews who fired APDS in combat rarely knew they were using one of the war's most closely guarded secrets. The German tank crews who died never knew what hit them. Even historians researching the war decades later have had to piece together the story from fragmentary evidence, because the full records remain sealed. What we're left with is a story that exemplifies the nature of technological warfare. It's not always about having more of everything. Sometimes it's about having one critical advantage, one technology that changes the rules of engagement. For Britain in World War II, APDS was that technology. It turned their medium tanks into giant killers. It gave their tank crews a fighting chance against superior German armour. It demonstrated that clever engineering could overcome material disadvantages. And perhaps most importantly, it showed that the side willing to take risks on new technology, to trust in science and innovation, could achieve outcomes that seemed impossible through conventional means. The fact that exact production figures remain classified 80 years later is itself revealing. It tells us that governments still see value in keeping certain technical details secret, even when the basic principles are well understood. It suggests that the supply chains, manufacturing processes, and resource allocation decisions involved in producing APDS still have relevance today. And it reminds us that for all we know about World War II, for all the books written and documentaries made, there are still secrets waiting to be revealed. In the end, the British trick that turned German supertanks into burning scrap wasn't really a trick at all. It was physics, applied with ingenuity and desperation in equal measure. It was the realization that in the equation of kinetic energy, velocity matters more than mass. It was tungsten carbide and careful metallurgy and sabots that separated cleanly at precisely the right moment. It was test firing after test firing until the design was perfect. It was the decision to use strategic materials for ammunition, betting that tactical advantage would outweigh strategic cost. And it worked. The German tanks burned, their crews never knowing that they'd been defeated not by a bigger gun or thicker armour on the British side, but by a fundamental reimagining of how kinetic energy could be applied to defeat armour. That reimagining shaped armoured warfare for the next 80 years, and continues to influence how tanks fight today. Not bad for a secret weapon whose exact production numbers we still don't know.